A disappearance that shocked the whole nation. Never before had such a quiet, unremarkable American suburb become the backdrop for a tragedy that would send chills across the country. It all began in the early hours of an ordinary August morning, when the routine peace was shattered by the inexplicable disappearance of a pregnant mother and her two young daughters. It wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a sequence of events that evolved into a profound national anxiety, exposing the darkest fissures beneath an idyllic facade. The woman at the center of this case was known for her warmth and connection. She didn't just pass through life, she shared it. Her social media posts, filled with family photos and messages of hope, painted a picture of the American dream fully realized. But overnight, she and her children appeared to vanish without a trace. No leads, no signs of struggle, only a trail of questions that quickly captured national attention. From the outset, the circumstances were so baffling and sudden that the entire community rallied to join the search. Local police, state authorities, and federal agents descended on the town, scouring it from corner to corner. Drones buzzed overhead, dogs sniffed through fields, and volunteers combed neighborhoods, desperate for any sign. Television screens were quickly flooded with the missing family's photos. Major news networks dispatched crews to cover every fleeting update. Strangers offered prayers and theories in online forums, while armchair detectives relentlessly pored over every bit of available information. What made this case uniquely unsettling was the complete absence of typical warning signs. There were no calls for help, no evidence of forced entry or violence. The mother's car, cell phone, wallet, and even her daily medications were found inside the home, as if she'd simply stepped out and never returned. Friends and family insisted this wasn't someone who would just run away, especially not with young children and another on the way. The sense of unreality intensified. How could an entire family simply cease to exist overnight, leaving their whole life, and a nation, in suspense? As the days passed, the pressure on detectives mounted. Law enforcement had seen countless cases before, but the sheer scale of this search, and the lack of useful leads, was almost unprecedented. Each hour, without answers, saw speculation flourish. Kidnapping, human trafficking, some hidden enemy, or perhaps something even more sinister. The FBI established headquarters in the neighborhood, combing through every interaction, bank transaction, and digital footprint. But despite the deployment of every available resource, the case remained stuck, hovering on the verge of despair. Television anchors spoke with barely hidden distress as the story looped continuously. Behind every broadcast was a chilling undertone. If such darkness could reach a family like this, in a community like theirs, maybe nowhere was truly safe. In town halls, in coffee shops, and in households across America, the question burned: what really happened to this family? At the heart of the case lay not only the agony of one family's disappearance, but a broader, more devastating fear, one that would echo through the entire country as the shocking truth slowly came to light. A peaceful town plunged into chaos. Frederick, Colorado, had always been the picture of Americana. Quiet cul-de-sacs filled with trim lawns, neighbors waving from driveways, and the steady rhythm of kids biking home after school. It was a place where news rarely traveled beyond local bake sales or maybe the high school football team's latest triumph. For generations, Frederick moved at this gentle pace, caught between its coal mining history and its post-industrial rebirth. Yet beneath this everyday tranquility, few realized just how fragile the sense of security really was. On the morning of the disappearance, that illusion was swiftly and brutally shattered. Police sirens pierced the dawn hush, churning up clouds of dust as cruisers sped down quiet residential streets. Word raced through the community faster than wildfire. A local mother and her children were missing, and no one could account for their whereabouts. Almost overnight, the whole town felt transformed. Neighbors fell into hushed, anxious clusters, eyes darting over hedges and behind drawn curtains. Coffee shop conversations stuttered mid-sentence, replaced with speculation and subtle fear. Frederick, once so certain in its safety, was now tangled in suspicion and whispered theories. The sense of unease intensified as the police presence grew. Uniformed officers combed the neighborhood, knocking door to door, while state police set up portable outposts at major intersections. Within hours, FBI vans and news media from Denver and beyond lined the otherwise sleepy streets. Helicopters whirred overhead, their searchlights raking over fields and rooftops deep into the night. Strangers who had once exchanged friendly smiles now eyed one another with uncertainty. After all, if a mother and two kids could vanish from their very own block, who was to say anyone else was truly safe? The disruption stretched far beyond emergency responders. Local churches organized prayer circles and schools sent notes home urging parents to talk frankly with their children about safety. Grocery shoppers paused at bulletin boards plastered with missing persons flyers bearing familiar faces. Even the rhythm of daily life felt off. Commuters checked their rearview mirrors more often, parents clutched their children's hands just a little tighter, and dog walkers kept closer to well-lit sidewalks. With every hour that passed without answers, whispers of conspiracy and worst-case scenarios multiplied. "Something like this doesn't just happen here," became the refrain on everyone's lips. Longtime residents rattled off how they'd never locked their front doors before, how the neighborhood had always looked out for its own. Now, wrought iron gates clicked shut each evening. Uncertain eyes monitored even the faintest movement outside. It was as if Frederick's innocence had been ripped away in one unimaginable instant, leaving behind a shockwave of anxiety, a quiet tragedy that pressed in from every shaded street corner. The storm of chaos wasn't just external, it rippled inward, stirring up old regrets and new fears. Parents questioned every tiny freedom their children once had. Couples re-examined their trust in each other. Even the rhythms of local businesses, open and close times, familiar faces behind counters, took on a strained, haunted edge. In so many ways the heart of Frederick beat more nervously, every pulse marked by a strange and unwelcome sense of vulnerability. For the first time, the people of this town truly faced the chilling reality that darkness could find them, no matter how carefully they tried to keep it at bay. The all-American suburban family. From the outside looking in, the Watts family embodied the American suburban ideal, a loving couple, beautiful children, and an inviting home on a quiet street. Shanann Watts, a spirited and charismatic woman, was the heartbeat of the household. Her radiant personality shone through every interaction, and she filled social media with joyful updates about her growing family, holiday celebrations, and personal triumphs over adversity. She had battled illness, faced financial setbacks, and still emerged as a figure of warmth and community engagement. Chris Watts, her husband, worked as an operator in the oil and gas industry, a steady, respectable career that allowed them to afford a spacious 5-bedroom house in Frederick, Colorado. The couple's 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, were the center of their shared universe. Rarely was there a family photo where the girls weren't beaming or playing games in the backyard. Their laughter echoed down the quiet cul-de-sac, a familiar sound to neighbors who admired the family's togetherness. Despite their seemingly perfect life, the Wattses were not immune to everyday pressures. Financial strain was a recurring undercurrent in their lives. Mortgage payments, medical expenses, and the everyday costs of raising a young family added up quickly. Yet Shanann never let these hardships dampen her optimism. She was known for her resilience, often sharing uplifting messages and motivational quotes online, hoping to inspire others facing their own struggles. Inside the home, routines were thoughtfully planned. Mornings started with the hustle of preparing breakfast and school runs, evenings brought family meals and story time. Shanann was especially attentive to details, from nutritious meal prep to organizing themed birthday parties. Evenings saw the family gathered around the dinner table or cuddled on the sofa watching movies. She prided herself on being a hands-on mother, meticulously balancing her career in direct sales with parenting and community involvement. Friends and neighbors couldn't help but be drawn to the Watts family's warmth. Shanann was quick to volunteer for community events, coordinate playdates for the kids, and offer support to anyone in need. Their home was often filled with laughter, homemade cookies, and visitors, all testaments to the family's open and generous spirit. Holidays were celebrated with elaborate decorations and joyful get-togethers, with extended family visiting regularly. The family's unity extended to social media, where Shanann fearlessly documented their journey, the ups and the inevitable downs. From heartfelt posts about her devotion to Chris and the girls, to candid reflections on her health struggles, she cultivated a sense of authenticity and hope. To the outside world, the Wattses were a testament to perseverance, and the promise that hard work, faith, and love could overcome most obstacles. Still, as idyllic as the scene may have appeared, no one outside the home could truly see behind the scenes. The cumulative pressures silently mounted, mortgage debt, long working hours, and the subtle strains that can erode even the happiest outward appearances. But for those watching, the Watts family remained an emblem of the American dream, vibrant, resilient, and blessed with a future that seemed as bright as their carefully curated family photos suggested. The fateful night and unsettling signs. That August night in Frederick, Colorado began like countless others. The air was warm, the town was quiet after sundown, and neighbors were tucked into their routines. Shanann Watts, exhausted from her business trip, was dropped off at her house by her friend Nicole just after 2 a.m. There was nothing remarkable in those final minutes before the house lights turned dark, just the usual exchange of goodbyes, reminders about the next morning's prenatal appointment, and the familiar clack of a front door closing for the night. But as the world turned and the sun rose, the first currents of unease began to ripple. Nicole, who knew Shanann's habits as only the closest of friends could, started texting by mid-morning. Morning texts went unanswered. A red flag for someone as plugged in as Shanann. Not a single social media update, no reply to any calls, no read receipt. As the hours ticked by, Nicole's worry became a gnawing dread. Shanann had never missed a prenatal checkup, let alone ignored messages from friends or work obligations. By lunchtime, Nicole drove back over with her young son in tow, determined to check in personally. The scene outside the Watts home was eerily still. Shanann's white Lexus sat in the driveway, keys presumably inside. No sign of departure, no doors left cracked open, no hurried footprints through the morning dew. Nicole knocked, called out, checked every window. Inside, there were no barks from the dog and no movement. The house seemed frozen at that hour just before dawn. The only motion came from Nicole herself, pacing the porch and walking the perimeter, her sense of panic rising with every unanswered ring at the bell. The tension built steadily into the afternoon. Nicole spotted none of the markers of a normal busy household, no children's toys in the yard moving, no shadow flickering past a window. As if holding its breath, the house sent out no trace of its occupants. Nicole's calls to Chris, Shanann's husband, were met with confusion and concern, but he insisted he knew nothing of his wife and daughter's whereabouts. While waiting for him to arrive, Nicole did what most friends might hesitate to. She called the police and reported her friend missing. When the responding officer arrived, Nicole provided a timeline and let her worry show. Chris soon pulled up, claiming to have last seen his family asleep in the early morning. Upon entering, however, everyone noticed more subtle but telling signs. The sheets had been stripped from the main bed, missing without explanation. Shanann's purse, her phone, and her daily medications were left behind. Strange for a woman who always kept her essentials close. The children's favorite blankets and toys, usually scattered about or held tightly in little hands, were nowhere to be found. These incongruities seemed minor at first, but for those who knew Shanann, nothing about her disappearance could be chalked up to happenstance. She was organized to a fault, a woman juggling career, household and pregnancy without letting details slip. Not updating anyone for hours, let alone leaving home without basics, was as alarming as a break-in. The growing swirl of unanswered questions was soon compounded by the absence of any clear struggle. No broken glass, no open windows, not a single sign of forced entry, just a clean, empty house holding its silence. Word traveled rapidly down the block, neighbors peeked from their windows, curious glances mingled with rising anxiety. Was it a family argument, medical emergency, or something else, something far more sinister, lurking behind the normal veneer of suburbia? By nightfall, the Watts house had shifted from a private domestic world to the center of an unfolding emergency. There is a particular kind of dread reserved for those first hours when someone simply vanishes, leaving the world to wonder about the secrets those walls might be holding. As lights flickered on across Frederick, so too did the realization. Something in their close-knit town had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The police step in, and the fragile days of hope. By the time the first squad car rolled onto Saratoga Trail, a subtle shift had already gripped the quiet Colorado neighborhood. Red and blue lights flickered against the stucco of neat houses, and uniformed officers fanned out across the property, their faces clouded with the seriousness reserved for the most urgent disasters. The Watts home, once simply another suburban residence, became ground zero, not just for the authorities, but for all the anxiety and questions swirling through the town. Detectives from the Frederick Police Department quickly realized that this was no ordinary missing persons case. The total lack of evidence, no struggle, no broken locks, no forensics pointing to a break-in, was both baffling and chilling. Signs of a life interrupted hung everywhere, a purse on the counter, medications left out, a phone plugged into a charger with unanswered notifications stacking up. Officers took meticulous notes, circling the home, speaking with neighbors, setting up yellow police tape to keep back curious onlookers who'd gathered on the street in hushed groups. Inside, they saw only confusion, an unmade bed, children's toys eerily undisturbed, reminders of everyday family routines suddenly rendered meaningless. Lead investigator Mark Jameson remembered the intense sense of responsibility, not just to find the missing, but to protect a shaken community desperate for reassurance. He ordered a full canvass of the area and called for backup from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI within hours of the initial call. Every moment felt heavier than the last as the case passed the threshold from urgent to critical. With little to go on, the search effort ballooned fast. Police dogs were brought in to pick up a scent. Officers knocked tirelessly on every door in the neighborhood, seeking the tiniest witness statement or overlooked clue. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the nearby fields and greenbelts even as the heat of midday shimmered over asphalt and lawns. Volunteers, friends, neighbors, complete strangers lined the streets printing flyers and pinning them to phone poles. Each face beamed back from the missing posters felt like a haunting plea for resolution. The pressure mounted with each passing hour. It wasn't just the local authorities feeling the heat. National news outlets grew fixated on the case. Reporters camped outside the Watts home, broadcasting live updates that shifted in tone from hopeful to somber. Online forums buzzed with speculation, conspiracy theories, and collective worry, a digital chorus echoing the tension that now gripped Frederick. The FBI even established a mobile command center nearby, setting up a hub for tips, daily briefings, and endless press conferences where the words "no new leads at this time" became an unwanted refrain. But no matter how many resources were deployed, no one could shake the sense that hope was slipping through their fingers. Family and friends did their best to stay optimistic, leaning on each other and the officers working tirelessly. Candlelight vigils were planned at local churches. Community members baked casseroles, writing encouragement cards and placing candles on the porch. The Watts' bright and open home was suddenly shadowed by dread. Every knock at the door both a prayer for good news and a shiver of fear that something unthinkable had happened. Through it all, detectives chased down every possible lead, no matter how thin. Security camera footage from neighbors was scrutinized frame by frame. Chris Watts, tight-lipped but outwardly cooperative, was questioned again and again, his statements carefully compared to timelines and known movements. As night fell on Frederick, porch lights burned later than usual. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. The day dragged into night, and then another day, the lines between hope and denial blurring in the minds of those waiting for answers. The hardest part, most agreed, was the not knowing, whether to hold on to hope or to begin grieving. Every phone call could be the call, every siren, the answer. But as the fragile days stretched on, the truth seemed to be hiding just out of reach, leaving both the authorities and all of Frederick suspended in a painful, uncertain limbo. A sense of unease envelops the small town. In the days and nights that followed the sudden disappearance of Shanann and her two daughters, Frederick underwent a transformation so profound it was as if the town's very spirit had been shaken. This was no longer the same sleepy Colorado suburb where strangers smiled at each other, where block parties blossomed in the warmer months, or where neighbors paused at each other's fences to chat about the weather and kids. Instead, a chilling, formless anxiety settled over every street, every cul-de-sac, and every home, altering the community's character in a way no one could have predicted. Frederick, by all accounts, had always prided itself on its shared sense of security and mutual trust. Parents let their children play past dusk in neighborhood parks, confident in the knowledge that watchful eyes and friendly faces were never far. But now, the familiar landscape seemed fundamentally warped. The parks were emptier, laughter faded from the sidewalks, and the unwritten promise of safety, a badge each resident wore quietly, had cracked. For the first time in living memory, people double-checked their locks, drew their blinds early, and looked into the faces of close acquaintances and wondered what secrets might be hidden behind their calm facades. Word of the missing Watts family traveled quickly, not just through television screens or social media feeds but in hushed phone calls, open windows, and worried notes passed between households. Every street lamp seemed to cast a longer shadow. There was nervous energy in every errand. At the local grocery store, customers found themselves speaking in vague, anxious tones, as if to name the incident might make it more real. Checkout staff offered somber greetings, scanning the faces of regular shoppers for signs of distress. School administrators held emergency meetings, reassuring parents while subtly coaching staff on how to address children's growing fear. The texture of community life, a fabric so intricately woven with countless traditions, began to fray. Churches, so often the heart of solace and healing, held prayer circles where attendance swelled overnight. Local pastors found themselves offering more counseling sessions, fielding questions that didn't always have answers. What should we tell our children? Was there any way to prevent this? Are our own families in danger? The sense of not knowing gnawed at young and old alike, a collective grief emerging, not just for the Watts family, but for the gradual loss of innocence Frederick was experiencing in real time. Coping mechanisms varied. Some residents found comfort in the camaraderie of search parties and volunteer efforts. Others retreated into their homes, overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation. Blockwatch groups emerged overnight as wary neighbors organized phone trees and shared late-night texts about anything that seemed unusual. A car slowly circling the block, a porch light left on past midnight, a strange noise carried by the wind. Rumors and theories raced through backyard fences and virtual communities. Some clung to hope, scouring every update for a sign of the missing, while others, despite themselves, began to brace for the worst. The physical presence of the ongoing investigation intensified these tensions. The steady pulse of police cruisers on patrol, the drone of helicopters above, and the clusters of reporters bracing their microphones all became part of the town's new ambiance. "It feels like we're living in a fishbowl," one mother confided to her friend while dropping her kids at school, scanning for unfamiliar faces. "Everyone is watching and nobody feels safe." Parents clustered in small, worried groups at playgrounds that only weeks ago echoed carefree laughter. Playdates were canceled, children kept inside, and even the smallest errands began to feel fraught with danger. Within individual homes, the unease trickled into daily routines. Spouses checked in with each other more often. Work schedules and after-school plans confirmed and reconfirmed in nervous whispers. In many homes, televisions remained on, tuned constantly to updates. Every new development became fodder for urgent discussion over dinner tables. Some teens rebelled against the atmosphere of fear, insisting on normalcy, while others internalized the anxiety and grew quieter, shunning sleepovers or outings they once begged for. Siblings bickered in the background as grown-ups argued softly about safety plans and emergency contacts. This new sense of vulnerability did not affect everyone equally. Older residents, many of whom remembered Frederick's more rural beginnings, grieved the loss of a time when the community truly seemed immune to the dangers they saw on the news. Newer arrivals, drawn to Frederick by its reputation for peace and safety, wrestled with guilt and confusion. Had they been naive, blinded by the suburb's outward calm? For all, the event became a defining feature of their lives. There was a before and now, heartbreakingly, an after. Rumors continued to build, feeding off fragments of overheard police radio, bits of news reports, or pure conjecture. Was it a random act? Was someone in town responsible? Had danger always been so near, cloaked in the mundanity of daily life? Conspiracy theories found roots in places where knowledge failed: the corner coffee shop, parents' groups, and digital message boards. Community leaders did their best to quell panic, but their reassurances rang hollow against the invisible weight pressing in from all sides. As the days stretched on, doubt began to replace disbelief. It became clear that the resolution wouldn't come quickly, if at all. By the flickering glow of porch lights, families lingered on their front steps before retiring inside, searching for connection in the shared experience of grief and fear. There was no manual for navigating a crisis like this, no precedent in Frederick's history to draw comfort from. Yet, as the initial shock faded into a heavier, persistent melancholy, new forms of resiliency emerged. Some neighbors rallied around those closest to the Watts family, delivering meals, walking dogs, leaving handwritten notes as small acts of kindness. Though gatherings were subdued, the threads of empathy and solidarity stubbornly held fast against the incursion of doubt. The town was diminished, its innocence irreversibly lost, but the shared ordeal forged new kinds of bonds, ones built not just of proximity, but of mutual understanding. As Frederick waited, perched between revelation and unresolved pain, everyone came to realize how thin the line separating ordinary life from chaos could be. In the end, the tragedy did not just belong to the family at its center, but to all who had believed in the sanctity of their shared world. Frederick had been forever changed, and in facing down the void left by that harrowing August, its citizens began the slow, aching task of rebuilding their sense of community, one gesture of hope at a time. Public opinion and media uproar across the United States. The moment the Watts family disappearance hit the news cycle, it was as if a spark ignited a dry prairie. the story blazed across the country in hours. What had started as a local search and investigation swiftly ballooned into a full-blown national obsession, fueled not just by the tragedy's mysterious nature, but also by the ever-watchful eye of American media and the country's insatiable hunger for true crime intrigue. In the blink of an eye, Frederick, Colorado had become the epicenter of a storm that stretched coast to coast, its quiet streets and devastated family at the center of 1,000 urgent headlines. Cable news anchors began their broadcasts with somber reflections, splashing family photos across screens as emotional background music played. National reporters flooded the small town, cameras and microphones in tow, eager to interview anyone with even the faintest connection to Shanann or her family. The Watts' smiling faces looped endlessly on morning shows, evening specials, and late-night cable panels. There was something about the disappearance, the seemingly perfect family, the apparent absence of clues, the hint of unspeakable tragedy, that made it impossible for the public to look away. Social media, the great amplifier of modern anxiety and empathy alike, soon transformed the case into a viral phenomenon. Hashtags bearing the Watts family name trended across platforms. Facebook groups sprang up overnight, some organized to coordinate search efforts or prayer circles, others devoted purely to dissecting each new snippet of information. True crime enthusiasts, armchair sleuths, and average citizens alike debated theories, analyzed timelines, and pored over news footage. A digital vigil unfolded with every refresh of a newsfeed, complete strangers drawn together by worry and a desire for resolution, even if all they could offer were thoughts, prayers, and speculation. But with those public prayers came mounting pressure. Local law enforcement found itself in the relentless spotlight of 24-hour coverage, forced to field constant inquiries from both network journalists and self-appointed online detectives. The need to balance transparency with the integrity of an ongoing investigation grew fiercer by the day. Chief among police concerns was the danger of misinformation. Rumors trickled out, sometimes by accident, sometimes fanned by sensationalist tabloids eager for an exclusive angle. A neighbor's offhand comment or a poorly sourced internet rumor could, it seemed, become national news within minutes, shaping and often distorting public understanding. As the story gained momentum, it morphed into a kind of cultural mirror, reflecting deep fears and anxieties resonant with countless viewers. This was not just about the Watts family, but about the fragility of domestic safety, the unpredictability of evil, and the limits of suburban security. All over America, people watched, wondered, and projected their own anxieties onto the case. Parents hugged their children tighter. Couples reevaluated their relationships, haunted by the possibility of unseen secrets. Opinion columns, television roundtables, and podcast episodes popped up almost overnight, each offering a new angle or moral lesson. Was this a crime of passion, a random act, or the unspooling of long-hidden tensions? The media dissected marriage dynamics, economic pressures, and the psychological toll of social media perfectionism. Commentators scrambled to explain the unknowable, using the Watts case as a starting point for debates about everything from mental health to suburban isolation to the vapid pursuit of online validation. For the family's loved ones, the glare of this attention cut both ways. On one hand, wall-to-wall news coverage kept the search effort urgent and energized, drawing nationwide attention and resources. Tips rolled in from across America, some helpful, many hopelessly off base. But the onslaught also brought a sense of invasion. Grieving relatives and friends were approached by journalists and sometimes even stalked by eager paparazzi. As the days ticked by with no resolution, frustration grew. Were all these eyes on Frederick genuinely hoping for justice or simply hungry for lurid details to fill another news cycle? In churches, schools, and workplaces, the question was the same. Had America's fascination turned into something allergic to resolution, something that thrived on uncertainty and discomfort? It seemed there was always a new angle to chase, a missing phone record, a cryptic social media post, a neighbor's remembered odd detail. Advocacy groups weighed in, offering support for missing persons investigations and critiquing law enforcement procedures, amplifying both hope and tension. Television networks, sensing the public's morbid fascination, extended coverage beyond the news, dedicating special segments and even primetime documentaries to the unfolding tragedy. True crime podcasts dropped multi-part episodes, fueling public speculation with interviews, audio reconstructions, and exhaustive dives into background details. Talk radio callers and podcast hosts debated what the case said about American life, the nature of evil, or the silent pressures stacking up inside the nation's homes. Even as the investigation moved forward behind the scenes, the spectacle of public scrutiny was inescapable. Families gathered nightly around TV screens waiting for some sign of hope. Online support groups swelled with sympathetic strangers, some simply offering prayers, others eager for the sense of purpose that comes from playing detective. Some questioned their own fascination, unable to turn away even as they acknowledged the pain at the story's heart. As hope began to give way to dread, the national conversation shifted. The story of the Watts family was no longer just a missing persons case. It had become a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a window into the darkest corners of the American experience. People kept watching, kept speculating, kept hoping for answers and meaning in a tragedy where so far neither was forthcoming. Piecing together life before the fateful day. Long before a single police cruiser appeared on Saratoga Trail, the Watts family's story was already unfolding in the quiet spaces between their daily routines. Life in any small American town is a gradual layering of memories, habits, and relationships built up with the reassuring constancy of shared meals, workdays, and whispered hopes for the future. For Shanann Watts, her husband Chris, and their girls Bella and Celeste, the months leading up to the tragedy were marked by a unique blend of resilience and struggle, hope and uncertainty, woven together in ways that weren't always visible from the outside. Shanann's journey began on the East Coast in New Jersey before she moved with her family to North Carolina. There, she distinguished herself by her drive. She was ambitious, tireless, and fiercely devoted to building a stable, loving home despite health challenges and financial setbacks. Her social media presence reflected this tenacity. Trace her posts, and you'd find a woman determined to document not only birthdays and holidays, but also the day-to-day victories and struggles. New jobs, old debts, morning routines, and surprise hugs from her daughters. Each snapshot was both a celebration and a shield. A way of affirming that no matter what uncertainties each month brought, their family bond remained unshakable. Chris's background was more understated but no less significant in shaping the family's story. Raised with strong Midwestern values, he prided himself on providing for his wife and daughters. A job at a local oil company offered financial security, but also long hours and unpredictable schedules. In the months before that fateful August, friends noticed Chris seemed distant at times, stressed by work perhaps, or weighed down by burdens he didn't share. Yet to the casual eye, he filled the role of the steadfast husband, helping with the kids, attending parent-teacher meetings, smiling in family pictures. The couple's love story, though genuine, bore the marks of real-world hardship. Within just a few years, they had navigated a series of financial crises: credit card debt, car payments, a crushing mortgage on their new Colorado home, even bankruptcy proceedings. Shanann's health issues, including a battle with lupus, only added to the sense of fragility. Bills piled up, medications became a monthly calculation, and the simple act of grocery shopping was more strategic than spontaneous. Still, Shanann tackled each obstacle with candor and optimism, often sharing advice for finding light in dark places with her growing online following. Family life in the Watts household centered on their daughters. Bella, bright and inquisitive, was the storyteller, the one who could charm her teachers and make friends wherever she went. Celeste, or Cece, was all energy and giggles, dashing around the house and into her parents' arms. Everyday routines were their anchors: crafts at the kitchen table, dance parties in the living room, bedtime rituals that Shanann orchestrated with precision and warmth. For outsiders, their home seemed blessed, a place buzzing with the creative, noisy joys of small children. Yet if you peeled back the surface, subtle cracks appeared. Friends recalled times when Shanann confided in them, her voice quiet as she admitted to anxieties about money or worries that Chris didn't always seem emotionally present. The pressures of mortgage debt and medical bills created real tension. There were late-night arguments behind closed doors, followed by carefully composed Facebook posts the next morning. Like many modern couples, they used social media as both scrapbook and mask, a tool for crafting a hopeful narrative, even when behind the scenes things were far from perfect. The months before the disappearance were a study in contrasts. On one hand, there were celebrations, birthdays, the announcement of Shanann's third pregnancy, family visits, and laughter echoing from the backyard. Shanann threw herself into preparations for the new baby, meticulously choosing names, sharing updates with friends, organizing the nursery, and posting heartfelt videos talking to her unborn child. Chris, for his part, alternated between gestures of affection, helping with chores, reading to the girls at bedtime, attending doctor's appointments, and moments of visible withdrawal. He took more solitary walks, responded tersely in conversations, and sometimes seemed absorbed in his phone late into the night. Among their circle, few suspected any deeper trouble. Shanann's friends described her as the glue that held everyone together. She organized neighborhood gatherings, fostered connections between parents at the girls' schools, and checked in on relatives near and far. Even as she privately nursed doubts about her marriage or held stress about looming bills, she continued building bridges outward, believing connection was the surest way to weather any storm. Her resilience inspired others, though it may also have concealed her most vulnerable moments. In their routine, there was both comfort and monotony. Chris's work in the oil industry demanded early mornings and occasional overnight shifts, often leaving Shanann alone with the girls for long stretches. She managed her own business from home, balancing calls, social media updates, and product deliveries around her children's schedules. At night, when the house quieted, she sometimes wrote long, searching messages to close friends, confiding her worries and hopes for her family's future. Her messages revealed a woman striving to keep faith in love, even as she sensed fault lines widening quietly at home. There were also pockets of hope. Despite setbacks, Shanann and Chris took small trips with the kids, picnics in the nearby park, visits to relatives in North Carolina, and adventures chronicled on Facebook. They celebrated milestones and anniversaries, with Shanann often leading the festivities, determined to infuse each event with meaning. Their home was covered with framed photos, handcrafted decorations, mementos from their journey together, a testament to both the effort involved in sustaining their life and the genuine joy they found in quiet moments. What few outside observers realized was how, beneath the polished surface, anxieties were accumulating. Chris's increasing distance, interrupted by bursts of affection, coincided with longer hours at work and new social contacts that Shanann didn't always recognize. Her instinct for detail, so evident in her parenting and her online persona, made her sensitive to even the smallest changes in behavior, missed texts, vague explanations, a coolness that seemed to linger. Tension crept in at odd moments, sometimes dissipating after a shared laugh, other times lingering long after the girls had gone to bed. Their finances, while manageable, were never far from crisis. Mortgage payments arrived every month like clockwork, demanding sacrifices in other areas. Shanann's entrepreneurial spirit brought extra income but also relied on her emotional energy and the goodwill of others, a fragile foundation. They bickered sometimes about priorities, about how to make ends meet, about Chris's long hours, and the ever-present shadow of what might happen if things truly fell apart. But after every disagreement, they seemed to return to a kind of hopeful truce, piecing together good days even amid uncertainty. Looking back now, the signs that all was not well were present but so easy to miss among the noise of everyday life. Friends would say, "They looked so happy together, we never guessed." Family members, reflecting after the tragedy, described an undercurrent of fatigue in Shanann's voice and a distracted edge to Chris's demeanor. But until that night when the ordinary world slipped so suddenly into nightmare, life in the Watts household continued. Meals prepared, stories read, baby names whispered in the quiet warmth between mother and children. Piecing together the period before the family's disappearance is an exercise in humility, recognizing that what we see, even in the most intimately documented lives, is only ever a fragment of the truth. The Wattses, like so many families, faced forward with courage, trying to build the best life they could with the tools and hope available. And despite all the pressures and hidden struggles, their days were filled with laughter, love, and that uniquely human faith that tomorrow might be, somehow, better than today. The hidden secrets of marriage behind glamorous social media. Behind every carefully crafted Instagram post or sunny Facebook update, there was a current of pain running quietly beneath the surface of Shanann and Chris Watts' marriage. To the outside world, to neighbors, friends, and a sea of social media followers, they epitomized the American dream, a loving couple, photogenic children, and a glowing house perpetually staged for holidays and milestones. Yet the gleam of online perfection belied a web of fear, secrecy, and slowly deepening chasms behind closed doors that almost no one could see. From the very beginning, Shanann used her online presence as a shield as much as a scrapbook. After all, she was proud of her hard-earned victories, overcoming illness, pulling her family through difficult financial times, and building a direct sales business with grit and optimism. In her posts, Chris appeared every bit the supportive husband, smiling at birthday parties, playing in the backyard, hugging their kids with gentle protectiveness. Shanann's captions overflowed with gratitude for the life they had built together, even on difficult days. But the digital highlight reel only told part of the story. Private messages between Shanann and her closest friends revealed a very different tone, one colored with fear and uncertainty. In the months before the disappearance, her texts grew longer, more confessional and heartbreakingly raw. She shared nights spent lying awake, fearing that Chris's affections had faded. She worried about unexplained absences, secretive hours spent on his phone, and a creeping sense that she was losing control over the one thing that meant everything to her, her family. The mounting tension was not just visible to Shanann's friends, but even palpable during family trips. There were holidays where Chris seemed withdrawn, his eyes distant even as he posed for photos with the girls. He began working late more often, and explanations for why he couldn't make it to family events became generic and evasive. The once frequent affectionate touches between husband and wife faded into surface-level gestures intended only for the camera. Shanann confided to friends that Chris had begun sleeping separately, always blaming it on work fatigue or stress. The truth, gnawing at her, felt far more ominous. For Chris, an internal struggle was underway. Outwardly, he maintained a placid composure, mowing the lawn, playing with his children, chatting with neighbors. Inwardly, however, he nursed a secret life that gnawed away at the foundations of trust. He grew closer to a co-worker, exchanging messages and excuses that soon blossomed into a full-fledged affair. The thrill of secrecy seemed to invigorate him, creating an alternate reality where he could escape the pressures of marriage and fatherhood. He became adept at covering his tracks, deleting text messages, and concocting believable alibis for his mysterious late-night outings. All the while, Shanann's anxiety mounted. She tried to confront Chris about his distance, sending him long, impassioned emails and handwritten notes pleading for honesty. Sometimes he responded with short reassurances or empty promises of trying harder, but more often than not, his replies left her feeling more adrift. Shanann's friends urged her to consider counseling, worried for her emotional well-being. She resisted, convinced that if she just worked harder, if she only loved enough for both of them, the old Chris would return. Her devotion, once a source of strength, became another way she blamed herself for problems she didn't create. This cycle of hope and heartbreak was made more intense by the pressures of projecting a perfect marriage for the outside world. Shanann's business thrived on her authenticity and positivity. How could she tell the truth online and risk exposing all her vulnerabilities to clients and strangers? Each social media post became a carefully edited patch in a digital quilt meant to hold their family together. Little did her followers realize she was using those platforms not just to celebrate her life but to attempt to save it. Chris, meanwhile, perfected his own mask. He went through the motions at home, attending ultrasound appointments, enduring birthday parties, and recording the occasional video with his daughters. Every smile that glimmered in a photo was, for him, another test of how well he could conceal the rising tide of guilt and resentment inside. His affair reinvigorated a feeling of autonomy and passion he believed he'd lost, but it also made every act of deception more difficult to sustain. The deeper Chris slipped into his double life, the more intangible became the possibility of reconciliation. The secret meetings, late-night texts, and financial expenditures on lavish dates and presents for his mistress could not remain invisible forever. Shanann, meticulous as ever, began noticing gaps in bank statements and spikes in credit card charges. Confrontations erupted more frequently, sometimes culminating in tearful arguments, sometimes in icy silences that lasted for days. All the while the children were buffered from this tumult, their routines unbroken and their smiles preserved for Shanann's carefully documented stories. Yet even as the tides of mistrust rose, Shanann worked tirelessly to maintain hope. She spoke to friends about booking counseling sessions for the couple, researching therapists, and reading self-help resources for repairing trust in a marriage. She agonized over whether to reveal Chris's infidelity to her parents or his, telling herself that airing their struggles would only make things worse. There was, in her mind, still a chance, however slim, that the marriage could be righted before the birth of their third child. But in private, Chris's intentions shifted. The responsibility of another child seemed overwhelming, compounding his growing wish for escape. He communicated candidly with his lover about dreams of a new life, discussing moving in together and even what their future might look like, unburdened by his existing family. To him, the digital world where he appeared to be a loving husband and father felt increasingly alien. Each day, the dissonance between the man he was in public and the man he wanted to be in private pulled him further from his family's orbit. As the weeks passed, cracks in the social media facade deepened. Friends and family noticed that Chris appeared especially emotionless in recent photos, his gaze glassy and vacant. Shanann's posts about love and gratitude took on an edge of desperate optimism, punctuated by occasional cryptic remarks about fighting for family and cherishing fleeting moments. The backdrop of their online presence, once a realm of shared happiness, now concealed fractures too deep to fully repair. On the surface, little changed. At neighborhood barbecues, Chris continued his affable small talk, mowing the lawn with headphones on and waving to neighbors as if nothing was wrong. Shanann organized birthday parties and community playdates, extending warmth to every guest even as her heart struggled. The truth, so carefully hidden, was now like a splinter, invisible to others but wounding with every breath. The tension bled into their nightly routines, hurried dinners, short goodnights, a sense of performance that hung around every interaction. All the while, Shanann still rooted for something to change, her determination tethered to hope, as though it could keep darkness at bay. Social media, for both, became a new battleground. Chris grew increasingly resentful of the public persona his wife curated, feeling boxed in by constant status updates and emotional posts he felt did not reflect reality. Shanann, for her part, clung to these platforms as lifelines, gathering support from distant friends in her community, using posts to force herself toward positivity even on the hardest days. The striking disconnect between their online presence and their private pain grew ever more pronounced. For the outside world, the Watts family continued to shine online, surviving setbacks, showcasing resilience, and promising unfading love. Nobody saw the midnight tears, the moments of desperate worry, or the nights Chris spent wishing for another life. Only in the aftermath would the full extent of Chris's deception and Shanann's heartbreak finally come to light, exposing how the relentless pursuit of appearing perfect on social media can mask, and even hasten, the unraveling of the human soul. Their marriage became a labyrinth of secrets, broken dreams, and unspoken pain. A cautionary tale for anyone who believes what they see online is the whole truth. In the end, the real tragedy was not just the betrayal and the violence that followed, but the isolation and silence that grew between them, brick by digital brick. In their attempt to craft an inspiring narrative for the world, Shanann and Chris learned too late that sometimes the cost of hiding the truth is greater than anyone can bear. The contradictory statements and the unexpected turning point. From the very beginning of the investigation, Chris Watts' demeanor perplexed investigators. Video footage from police body cams and interviews revealed his stiff, rehearsed answers and an almost mechanical air of cooperation, but detectives, trained to read nuance, could already sense subtle cracks in his performance. Though the worried husband and father appeared ready to help, Chris's choice of words was odd. He almost exclusively spoke of his wife and daughters in the past tense, a linguistic slip that immediately triggered suspicion among law enforcement. To them, it felt like an unconscious confession. With the case growing colder by the hour, every detail in Chris Watts' timeline came under scrutiny. Surveillance footage from the family's own security system as well as from nearby properties was checked for clues. Footage from the morning of the disappearance confirmed something unsettling. After 5 a.m., Chris was the only adult seen entering and leaving through the garage, making several return trips between the truck and the house in the still muted Colorado dawn. There were no signs of his wife or daughters. To the investigators, it looked less like a man preparing for a normal day at work and more like someone quietly orchestrating something unthinkable. The discovery of Chris's extramarital affair soon added gasoline to the fire. Initially, Chris had insisted that his marriage was happy, but as police confronted him with mounting evidence, phone records, secret messages, and corroboration from his co-worker with whom he'd been romantically involved, his defenses began to erode. Detectives noticed the contradictions in his statements about his wife's emotional state, his family's finances, and their last interactions. While Chris oscillated between stoic calm and flashes of distress, every inconsistency seemed to nudge the investigation away from a disappearance and toward a possible homicide. During repeated interviews, Chris's story shifted subtly. At first he stated that he had left for work early and had no idea what happened after he left. Then, as his timeline was challenged by surveillance and digital evidence, his claims became more vague, sometimes asserting that Shanann had taken the girls to a friend's house, other times suggesting she might have simply run off, due to stress or family tension. None of these explanations fit the evidence. Shanann's purse, car, phone, and even life-saving medications were still in the house. The children's favorite blankets, always by their side, had also vanished. Chris's attempts to explain their absence rang hollow. Behind the scenes, the mounting physical and digital evidence pressed the investigation into a tight corner. Investigators found inconsistencies between Chris's statements and the facts uncovered through forensic analysis. Cell phone triangulation placed Chris exactly where he shouldn't have been, at a remote oil field owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum, during the crucial hours after the disappearance. GPS data from his truck matched with security camera timelines told a silent story that flatly contradicted his claims. Chris agreed to a lie detector test, perhaps thinking he could talk his way through as before. But seasoned polygraph examiner Tammy Lee saw through the veil. During questioning, Chris's anxiety became visible. Beads of sweat marked his brow, his answers grew clipped, and his body language changed from open to tightly wound. When confronted with the polygraph's results, clear indicators of deception, Chris could barely compose himself. In a room full of law enforcement, he broke down, requested to speak to his father, and finally reached the breaking point investigators had anticipated all along. The turning point was not a single dramatic confession, but a tidal wave of shattered denials. In the presence of police and his own father, Chris Watts, face crumpled with tears, finally admitted he had been untruthful from the start. The details of his confession stunned even the most experienced detectives. He claimed at first that Shanann had harmed their daughters, an assertion quickly dismissed by the evidence and forensics. As officers pressed him further, Chris's narrative unraveled entirely. He confessed to murdering Shanann in a moment of supposed rage and then, heartbreakingly, took the lives of both little girls, an act so brutal and incomprehensible that it left everyone present shaken. The confession marked an irreversible shift in the investigation. The Watts home, once a hub for hopeful search efforts, became a crime scene in the most devastating sense. Teams of officers gathered evidence under a new, chilling light, bedsheets missing from the master bedroom, traces of movement between garage and driveway, a timeline that now pointed to murder and concealment rather than a mysterious vanishing. Forensics teams scoured not just the house, but Chris's truck and the remote oil site revealed in his confession, places where he admitted he'd hidden the bodies in a last desperate attempt to mask his crime. Word spread rapidly through the law enforcement community, and then the world. The family everyone mourned had been taken not by strangers, but by the very person they trusted most. Chris was arrested, charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of pregnancy, and tampering with dead bodies. His calm mask was irrevocably shattered in the harsh lights of press conferences and courtrooms. This stunning revelation reverberated throughout Frederick and far beyond. Detectives who had spent days hoping for a hopeful ending now spent sleepless nights haunted by the horror at the core of the case. The community recoiled in collective grief and disbelief. For a brief moment, the perverse hope that maybe, somehow, the missing might still be found alive was replaced by the insistent ache of truth, and the question of how such unimaginable cruelty could exist just beyond the walls of an ordinary home. For those who had watched Chris's public pleas for the safe return of his family, the confession brought a new shock. All the words, all the tears, all the acts on television had masked something darker than anyone could have imagined. For the police, for Frederick, for the broader public, this case would forever symbolize the most jarring kind of betrayal, not just against trust, but against the fundamental bonds of family and community. Revealing a horrifying crime. The moment Chris Watts confessed, the case shed its final layers of ambiguity, revealing depths of horror that stunned even the most hardened investigators. In a matter of hours, what had started as a missing persons investigation spiraled into one of the most chilling, premeditated crimes in recent American memory. The facade that had concealed the Watts family tragedy crumbled, and the grisly truth sent shockwaves through Frederick, Colorado, and far beyond its borders. After Chris's partial confession, detectives immediately mobilized every available resource. The first focus was the remote oil site owned by Anadarko Petroleum, the place Chris admitted to visiting on the morning of his family's disappearance. Law enforcement teams raced against time, acutely aware that any remaining evidence at the site could quickly be lost in the span of a working oil field. The sense of urgency was palpable, each mile along the dusty Colorado highways thick with dread and determination. Arriving at the site, investigators found themselves in a sprawling industrial landscape, surrounded by tank batteries, pipelines, and the eerie hush of deserted machinery. It was here, among the vast emptiness, that the worst became reality. Meticulous forensic teams cordoned off the area. With painstaking care, they began searching for signs of what Chris claimed to have done, a search that would, in its conclusion, forever haunt those present. The first discovery was heartbreaking. The bodies of Bella and Celeste, concealed inside separate oil tanks. The gruesome scene left even veteran officers shaken to the core. The children, so recently the subjects of missing persons posters and church candlelight vigils, were now witnesses to a tragedy no one could have anticipated. Every step investigators took was measured, evidence meticulously gathered in the hopes of providing answers and justice. Not far from the tanks, Shanann Watts was found in a shallow grave, the red Colorado earth barely disturbed above her final resting place. Each new detail laid bare the monstrous betrayal at the heart of the case. Forensic experts descended on the oil site and family home, combing through every inch for physical evidence, fibers, footprints, evidence of strangulation, and patterns in the disturbed earth. The children's remains bore signs that told of desperation and innocence lost. Forensic analysis was able to reconstruct with chilling precision the events of that night and morning, how Shanann, upon returning from a business trip, became the first victim, followed by her daughters, each murdered and then transported hours away to a place Chris believed could hide his actions forever. The technical evidence was overwhelming. GPS data from Chris's company-issued truck mapped his movements in excruciating detail, matching timelines provided by security cameras and corroborated by digital footprints on his phone. Surveillance footage within the Watts neighborhood captured Chris's hurried trips between the house and truck mere hours before dawn, confirming what investigators already feared. Law enforcement's reconstruction showed just how calculated each step had been, not a crime of passion, but a deliberate bid to erase a family from existence. Autopsy reports painted an even grimmer picture. Each victim bore physical evidence of strangulation or suffocation, a violence that contrasted cruelly with the family's image in photographs and holiday cards. Toxicology results, crime scene photos, and the careful cataloging of every detail would later be key in confronting the perpetrator and securing justice in court. As these findings became public, the national sense of grief deepened and anger smoldered. How could someone so intimately connected to the victims perpetrate such savagery? The community and wider nation reeled as news of the crime scene filtered into public consciousness. Candlelight vigils that had begun with prayers for a safe return became memorials for 3 lives lost to a father's and husband's hands. Townsfolk and strangers alike wept openly, churches filled with stunned, grieving families processing the unfathomable brutality among their own. Frederick, once defined by its tranquility, became the backdrop to a grim new chapter in the American true crime canon. For the investigative team, the weight of the case pressed down long after the evidence was collected and cataloged. Lead detectives spoke candidly in court and to the media about sleepless nights and the lasting psychological toll. Some found themselves haunted by the memory of opening those oil tanks or walking the red earth of the shallow grave, improbable witnesses to humanity's capacity for darkness. The case became a rallying point within law enforcement, both a cautionary tale about the power of double lives and the importance of vigilance in the preliminary stages of every missing persons case. As the investigation drew to a close, prosecutors assembled a mountain of evidence so damning that Chris, confronted with the totality of his actions and the enormity of his betrayal, entered a guilty plea. The courtroom was packed for sentencing. Friends, family, journalists, and townsfolk gathered to bear witness as the horror was recounted in unflinching detail. Letters and statements read aloud forced all present to grapple with the unfathomable violence that had destroyed a family, an event as senseless as it was meticulously planned. The brutal manner in which Belle, Celeste, and Shanann were taken prompted soul-searching far beyond Frederick. Media outlets and social commentators debated the hidden pressure points of suburban life, marital struggles, financial stress, the double-edged sword of social media, and the inability of even the closest friends and neighbors to detect signs of impending tragedy. Advocacy groups called for greater awareness of domestic violence, arguing that the Watts family story exposed the need for earlier intervention and deeper community support. But above all, the revelation of Chris's crime, and the means by which he carried it out, etched a permanent scar on all who followed the case. It became more than just a headline, transforming instead into a national parable about the dangers of secrecy, unchecked isolation, and the monstrous results that sometimes emerge when appearance takes priority over truth. The Watts case would live on not only in police manuals and court transcripts but in the collective memory of a nation stunned by evil where it least expected it. For Shanann's and the girls' families, the revelations were a second loss, a shattering, almost surreal confirmation that the person they trusted most was the architect of their pain. None of them had truly believed Chris could be capable of such calculated brutality. The words spoken by family members at public memorials and in emotional press conferences often struggled against a tide of disbelief. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and friends described their last memories, simple goodnights, phone calls, or cheerful Facebook messages, now haunted by the knowledge of what was to come. The pain was compounded by the public nature of the tragedy, as every detail of the murder investigation made headlines and every new fact became the subject of discussion on talk shows and social media. The psychological profile that emerged from the case was chilling in its ordinariness. Chris Watts had presented himself as a model husband and father to the outside world while hiding desires, frustrations, and motivations that slowly twisted into something deadly. Forensic psychologists and criminal experts called in to dissect the case on television and in scholarly articles found themselves at a loss to explain how someone with no violent criminal history could orchestrate such violence. Theories abounded, some focused on his desire for a new start with his mistress, others on the suffocating weight of debt, marital strife, and lost identity. But in the end, no single motive could encompass the horror of what transpired. In the aftermath, the crime scene became a site of grim pilgrimage. Journalists and true crime followers descended on Frederick, snapping photos of the suburban home where trust had been betrayed, and visiting the oil site that, anonymous and industrial, now stood as a silent monument to the family's erasure. Documentaries and investigative specials reconstructed the timeline, interviewing everyone from trauma specialists to neighbors still grappling with guilt that they noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The home was eventually sold, but for locals, the address would forever evoke a raw ache, a reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight. The court proceedings were emotionally searing. Prosecutors described every step of the cover-up, the disposal of Shanann and the girls, the elaborate web of lies Chris spun to co-workers and friends. Chris's admission of guilt spared the families the ordeal of a public trial, but it did not lessen the magnitude of the loss. Expert testimonies laid bare how methodical and emotionless his actions had been in the aftermath, from text messages sent to concerned friends to stoic interviews on television where he begged for the return of those he had already murdered. At sentencing, impact statements from family members called for the harshest possible penalty and spoke to unimaginable grief, the loss of 3 beloved lives and the destruction of all hope for reconciliation. On the national stage, the Watts murders came to symbolize more than an act of individual madness. They prompted reflection on the fragility of family, the illusion of control offered by carefully curated social media profiles, and the urgent need to see beyond the surface in our personal relationships and communities. The story was discussed on talk shows, a catalyst for conversations about detecting subtle signs of domestic trouble and the psychological phenomenon of the family annihilator. Academics and nonprofits launched forums and campaigns using the case as a touchpoint for outreach and prevention, hoping that increased dialogue might save lives in the future. Meanwhile, the slow work of healing began in Frederick. The community organized remembrance events, planted trees in parks, and created scholarships in memory of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Their faces became symbols for advocacy, the Watts Clause proposed in legislative circles, aiming to tighten monitoring and intervention in domestic abuse cases. In a nation captivated and horrified, the tragedy became more than just a cautionary tale. It was a stark call for compassion, vigilance, and the everyday courage to reach out when something feels amiss. The mask falls, and the final sentence. The mask that Chris Watts so deliberately wore, both in the eyes of the public and his innermost circles, finally slipped once and for all in the cold light of the justice system. The aftermath was a mixture of media frenzy, legal drama, heartbreak for the family, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief and sorrow that radiated far beyond Frederick, Colorado. While America watched with bated breath, a courtroom became the stage on which decades of hidden pain, betrayal, and unimaginable violence were finally named and confronted. As the police revealed the full confession and laid out the mountain of evidence, Admissions, digital trails, GPS locations, forensics from the oil site, prosecutors turned their focus to the judicial process. Chris Watts, now devoid of any possibility to maintain his false narrative, was formally charged with multiple counts: the murders of his pregnant wife, Shanann, his two daughters, Bella and Celeste, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with bodies. Each count was a chilling echo of the trust, innocence, and love he had destroyed. In the days leading up to the trial, national interest surged to a fever pitch. People lined up outside the courthouse, some hoping for a glimpse of the man behind the monster, others wishing to offer silent support for the Rzucek family, Shanann's parents and brother, who became the voice for the victims lost and the millions of families who saw themselves reflected in this tragedy. Reporters scribbled in notepads, cameras flashed, and anchors rehearsed somber monologues. In stark contrast, within the wood-paneled corridors of the court, a deep stillness pervaded. This was no longer just a true crime spectacle, it was an extended reckoning. Chris entered the courtroom shackled and thin, his face remarkably devoid of true emotion, something that unsettled observers and even veteran officers. He pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid a possible death sentence, a legal strategy that spared him trial by jury but not the full measure of public scorn. Shanann's family, hands trembling and voices sometimes cracking under the weight of memory and grief, delivered their victim impact statements to the world. These emotional testimonies were more than legal formalities. They were the final declaration of lives shattered, of birthdays lost, giggles silenced, futures destroyed before they could unfold. Mr. Rzucek, Shanann's father, stared at Chris and tearfully asked, "Why? Why didn't you just let them live? Why didn't you just leave?" The judge, visibly moved by the scope of the crime, did not mince words when handing down the sentence. Chris Watts was given 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy and 36 years for 3 counts of tampering with bodies. He would never walk free again, condemned to spend the rest of his life in the confines of a correctional facility. "The most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled in my 17 years on the bench," the judge called it, adding that the horror of this crime has devastated not only the family, but an entire community. For the Watts and Rzucek families there was no true closure, only a grim certainty about what had happened and a lifelong wound that would never fully heal. Letters and statements released later, including further admissions from Chris Watts while in prison, revealed even more disturbing details about his state of mind and motivations. According to these accounts, his primary driver for murder was a wish to be unencumbered by his family in order to pursue a relationship with his mistress. The cold, methodical planning laid bare the depth of his self-absorption and lack of empathy, deepening the collective sense of horror and betrayal. The community of Frederick, once a quiet suburb, grappled with the lingering scars of the ordeal. School counselors supported traumatized classmates. Neighbors erected trees and benches in memory of Shanann and the girls. The Rzucek family became advocates for domestic violence awareness, speaking at events to urge people to look behind the veneer of happiness and reach out before it's too late. National discussions intensified around themes of toxic masculinity, the limitations of social media, highlight reels, and how communities can support families in crisis. For those watching from afar, the Watts case illuminated the ways a person can so thoroughly compartmentalize their darkest intentions and how evil may go undetected behind closed doors for years. In the world of criminal justice, it became a textbook study of the necessity for persistence, evidence, and the willingness to dig past perfect surfaces. Podcasters, journalists, and even novelists continue to dissect the case, not to glamorize it but in hopes of learning warning signs, patterns, and ways to prevent something so dreadful from ever repeating. Chris Watts' final sentence was not just the end of a legal saga, it was the public collapse of a carefully constructed mask. For so long he had lived 2 separate realities, one for the world and one for himself. When at last the mask was stripped away, what remained was a cautionary tale for every family, every neighbor, and every heart seeking hope in the illusion of outward perfection. In the years since, the echo of that courtroom verdict has lingered as both condemnation and warning. Justice was served, but the void left behind, of 3 bright souls, of trust betrayed, of a community forever changed, remains a haunting reminder. Evil does not always come disguised as a monster. Sometimes it wears the mask of the ordinary, and the true tragedy is how long it can go unseen.